I like to learn. That's why I like James Lindsay. I learn things from him, and he's an anti-communist like me, and he talks a lot about Maoism and things like that. And sometimes people will come back at him and say, what are you talking about? That's too over the top. But no, it's exactly what we're seeing in this country. Joining me now, my friend James Lindsay. He writes books, The Marxification of Education, Race Marxism. I really love that one. Also, you can find his stuff at New Discourses. James, it's hard for many people to realize that we're not dealing with 1960 America anymore. It's not, well, Republicans and Democrats, and we're going to disagree on some things. We got some blue dogs here. It's just too much for many people to accept, isn't it?
It's hard for people to accept that the world that they thought we lived in is not the world that we live in, and that to the degree that it was true, that the rugs have been pulled out from under their feet. Yeah, it's really hard for them to see that we're in a completely different situation now.
Why are we in a different situation? Because like when I sit down with my parents, now thankfully my parents aren't that way, but let's say I sat down with my parents and I was trying to explain to them no, Mom, Dad, it's different now. How do I explain that to the older person who doesn't understand that he has committed communists who run his country now?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of pieces to it, so it's not really easy. One of the first things that you should talk about, though, because the biggest sticking point that I find for folks is that they say, well, they can't possibly be run by communists if they're using corporations and banks to do what they do. So it's very important to point out that the Marxists of what was called the New Left, that were abandoning the old Marxist left in the 1960s, 1970s, became very attached to what they're going to recognize now as identity politics. But in the process, they very openly were rejecting the working class. They said that the working class had actually been stabilized and they'd become a counter-revolutionary force and conservative force because capitalism was allowing them to build a better life, a life that they liked, a life that they enjoyed. And so all of a sudden, what you have is happening through the 60s and the 70s is you have a movement in left-wing Marxist thought that uncouples from any fealty to the worker and thus any hostility to the managerial elite in the corporation. So they could actually work their way into those corporations and start exerting their power from within them.
Now, how did they pull this off, though, James? And I love that you've been talking about this a lot recently. I was breaking this down a little bit about BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard and how we see Bud Light do something stupid that costs itself its business. And we like that we're boycotting and all that stuff's good, but there's something bigger at play here. I love how often you talk about this. There's a bigger reason why the CEO of Anheuser-Busch sits down and puts a tranny on his beer can. Why does he do that?
Well, what it's boiled down to is over the last 20 years, it started in 2003, and we could talk about stuff before that where, they infiltrated the long march through the institutions and so on, especially all levels of education, and created an entire managerial class that was going to be sympathetic to these kinds of views and soft to these kinds of views, or even actively pushing them through HR. But this kind of comes together, especially through the HR dimension, from a device created in 2003 at the United Nations. It's called ESG, Environmental, Social, and Governance Scoring for Long-Term Investment Funds. So virtually every stock out there has an ESG rating attached to it. And if they have good ESG scores, they can be listed in ESG compliant indices, and they get all these other kind of perks and benefits. There are these things I just learned about recently called sustainability linked loans, SLLs, that were developed in 2017. Where if you're playing ball with that regime, they give you better interest rates, they give you access to bigger lines of capital or lines of capital at all. And these mechanisms are being run through these gigantic financial institutions, which don't use their own money. They manage other people's money, trillions of dollars of people's retirement funds, and they're betting them on what's called impact investing, environmental impact, social justice impact. And the G stands for governance. How do you run your corporation? In other words, do you do it the way that they tell you to? So that they can put this top-down control over every corporation. So if Anheuser-Busch doesn't want to lose its ESG score, that S component is social justice. It's going to put Dylan Mulvaney on a beer can. And then when the public gets mad and boycotts them, they're going to stand up for Dylan Mulvaney, which they did not do. And guess what? They lost. They got put on notice. They got a letter from the Human Rights Campaign saying you didn't stand up. We're going to dock you on your corporate equality index unless you double down, and your ESG score will suffer. And guess what? That sustainability linked loan or those lines of credit or the people that they've placed on the board to satisfy the G score are all going to be really upset with you, and you're going to have a bad time. In other words, it's a cartel. It's a racketeering scam using the equivalent of a social credit score on our corporations to make them compliant to ESG.
Okay, James, I'm glad that you break it down, but it seems so big and evil and nefarious. There's these big evil corporations on top forcing all this stuff down. So how do we begin to reverse it? All right, we've identified the problem. It's because Norm doesn't get it yet. We'll get back to him. How do we stop it? What do we do about that?
Well, it's a racketeering hustle. So we bust it the same way you break any other racketeering scam. Some of this might actually be in violation of RICO, of racketeering law. So what you need to do is take people like the executives at Anheuser-Busch who are now on notice, and take people, and they've had this just happen to them, or people at the executives of Target who are flailing around having emergency meetings, or you name the corporation, any of these big corporations that's now getting put on this boycott notice, or even other ones, you haul them in front of House Oversight Committee. You hound the House Oversight Committee to start bringing these people in. You hound your senators. You hound your state attorneys general to start pushing to expose why is this happening. Because what you have to do if you want to get a cartel to break, if you want to break a racketeering operation, is you've got to get people in the middle to realize that their best deal is to make a bargain with you and to tell all they know, tell what's going on, and get themselves off the hook for participating in it. And then what you just do is you start chasing it up the chain, and eventually you get to the place where we can start doing some prosecutions, lawsuits, et cetera. If I were a stock owner in Disney, I would be very interested, for example, in pushing for fiduciary responsibility violation lawsuits. These kinds of things are going to put that pressure on them, and then the hearings are going to bring out the story. If you're an investigative journalist, you've got to pull out the story. Norm isn't involved in this, but these are the kinds of things that are going to have to happen. So we have to keep the Norm, what he does is he's got to keep the pressure on. He's got to keep Bud Light in between a rock and a hard place so that it keeps being shown that there's a reason that we need to investigate deeply and get the law involved. And then slowly but surely, we get a couple of corporations to flip, then you're going to get 10 to flip, then you're going to start breaking up the whole scam.
James, so this can be done. Can this be done? Can it begin at the state level? And I say that because national politics, I have no faith in it whatsoever. No faith in the federal government, either party. Can states begin? States have a lot of juice.
I think states is where a lot of the activity, especially at the present moment, and is going to have to happen. But that doesn't stop us from getting, say, the House Freedom Caucus or the House Oversight Committee or certain senators from holding hearings. Those hearings may not do anything in and of themselves at the federal level, but what they do is they get stuff on record, under oath, and they start getting that information out there that's going to be able to give the states something that they can bite into, get prosecutors and investigators something that they can get their teeth into, and really start to force the situation. Ideally, though, what you want to do is think of your average corporation in the United States as being under the pressure of the mob. And so you want to think, I detest, if your 15-year-old got told by the heroin dealer running the block he's going to sell heroin for him, you're not going to like your 15-year-old's behavior. You're not going to be happy with him. But the main thing you're going to want to do is figure out a way to get him out of the mob, or out of the gang, out of the mob, whatever it is, and protect him. And so what we've got to do is approach our corporations the same way.
I like it. James, appreciate it, man. Come back soon. That's what we got to do.
For too long, we've been led to believe that communism is a thing of the past. But the truth is, communism is alive. It's here, and it's infiltrating every aspect of American life. Introducing the Anti-Communist Manifesto by Jesse Kelly, the practical guide for patriots ready to defend our nation from its most dangerous enemy. Discover the shocking extent of communist infiltration in our education system, their alliance with American corporations, and the twisted truth behind environmentalism. This eye-opening book exposes the true face of communism and empowers you to fight back. Join the fight for freedom. Pre-order your copy of the Anti-Communist Manifesto today by going to jessekellybook.com.